Hello, everybody. Hello and happy Halloween to both our live attendees and our live stream attendees. I'm Natalie Wagner, president of the Wagner Society of New York. We've been through a lot since March 2020. The previous seminar on Dutchman was ultimately presented in 2 sessions on our YouTube channel, as all live events were canceled, as you know, 3 days before the scheduled date. This time, we're offering the seminars both live and live streamed, and I want to thank the members who've have helped with many details needed for this seminar. It was particularly complicated with the change in venue from previous years and the COVID requirements. Your program has the dates of the previous seminars. We have had almost every great performer in Meistersinger at our Metcast roundtables, including when the Schenk-Schneider-Seamson production was new in 1993. Sir Donald McIntyre and Herman Pry were in that Metcast roundtable. You'll see some pictures outside. You might want to take a look and see if you can guess all of them. McIntyre said of Sachs' monologue, "It's talking about German art, not weapons and swords and the rest of it. It's German art that will bring us through. That's the essence of what this piece is about." I think that's well worth remembering. The Met Archives had a review of that production by Richard Dyer in the Boston Globe. He wrote, "Is there any more fulfilling place to be than caught up in a performance of Meistersinger? The Met's new production began at 6:30 and ended well after midnight, and I didn't want it ever to end." I think that's how many of us feel about Meistersinger. We're honored that Victoria Bond is our moderator, as she has been scheduled for our Dutchman seminar. She is a composer, and her opera Clara, based on the life of Clara Schumann, premiered in Baden-Baden in 2019. She has composed operas, ballets, piano concertos, and many other works. She's also an active conductor, a lecturer, and the artistic director of cutting-edge concerts that have taken place here for many years. And she's received many awards. And she and Jeffrey Swann were graduate students together at Juilliard. Victoria, I turn everything over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Natalie. So welcome, everybody. And I just want to give a brief introduction. Not only is Jeffrey Swann a virtuoso pianist and a prize winner of such distinguished awards as the Dino Ciani and the Queen Elizabeth competition and top honors in the Van Cliburn competition, but he is also my dear friend. As Natalie mentioned, we were in school together at Juilliard, and it has taken this seminar to bring us back together. So I am absolutely delighted to welcome to the stage Jeffrey Swann.
Talking about Meistersinger is sort of such a privilege and an honor that I always have to start any talk about Meistersinger with my favorite quote about Meistersinger. It's actually my wife's favorite quote. My wife, Meistersinger is her greatest love. And the quote is from Ignaz Paderewski, the great Polish pianist, who in, I think, 1921 wrote, "Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg is the greatest accomplishment in human history in any form of human endeavor whatsoever." Which is, and my wife always adds, to say the least. This is a big statement, but there's a lot to be said for that. I'm going to talk about one aspect of Meistersinger. Like all of Wagner's great works, there are many aspects. But one of the characteristics of Meistersinger is that it is a work of art, about the role of art, about the role of artists, who is an artist, where does the artist get his or her inspiration, what is the role of society in art? How does the artist interact with society? How does the artist interact with tradition? And how does the artist innovate or create new from tradition? All of these are really at the heart of what Die Meistersinger is about. And today I'm going to focus on the dynamic relationship in this exploration of what is an artist and the artist's relationship with society, insofar as it relates to the artist's relationship with the past and the future. and the elements of past art with future art, and also good art versus bad art. What is good? Which is a major question. Now, one other work of Wagner's is more or less about this subject partially, and that's Tannhäuser. And as we'll see in a little bit, I think that Meistersinger on one level is far more successful than Tannhäuser about dealing with one of these aspects. I think that even though it's very important not to overemphasize biographical information in understanding a work of art, I'm one of the first people who always says don't fall into the trap, don't interpret the piece from the life. I think there are things about Wagner's life at the time that he writes Meistersinger that are pretty essential in understanding how a work like Meistersinger came about. I think the most important fact is that Meistersinger came at the time of Wagner's greatest desperation. He was at the absolute low point of his life. Not just because he didn't have a job and he was hopelessly in debt, and he was still exiled from his home country, but also because he had the life project, the Ring of the Nibelungen, which was his big thing, was suspended, and I think in his heart of hearts, in 1863, 1864, he seriously doubted that he would ever finish it, that there would ever be the chance to come back and finish it. At the same time, Wagner had just written Tristan und Isolde, his most revolutionary piece, and let's not kid ourselves, Wagner knew just how great and unique Tristan was. And in 1861, they attempted a performance of it in Karlsruhe, and it failed immediately. I mean, they couldn't, it was just much too hard. And then in 1863 and 1864, they tried to put on Tristan in Vienna, and after 70, some people say 77 rehearsals, it was given up as impossible. And on top of which the tenor, Anders, went mad. So, which is not as bad as the first tenor who actually sang the role. He died. Schnorr von Karosfeld, poor guy. But in any case, Wagner, things were not looking good for Wagner. All of his fondest projects seemed to have gone to nothing. And his wife had just died. They didn't have a good relationship, but that was also an ending. I'm going to tell an anecdote, not a story, true story, and which may or may not have real concrete relevance to the creation of Meistersinger. But I love this story, and I have a friend who would call this intellectual terrorism. If it is, so be it. While in Vienna, for the purpose of putting on this Tristan, which never took place, it finally would the next year, but at the end of 1864, Wagner's life changed completely with the Deus Ex Machina of King Ludwig coming into his life, which of course radically changed everything. Wagner met Brahms, who had just gotten a job in Vienna, and Brahms 20 years younger than Wagner, and Brahms played for Wagner a piece that he had just written, a piano piece called the Handel Variations, for big set of variations based on not a theme by Handel, but he said it was Handel. But it's kind of a ersatz Baroque theme, which already should be sounding a little familiar, because the Meistersinger is largely constructed out of ersatz Baroque themes. Ersatz in that they're not real Baroque themes, they could not be real Baroque themes, but they evoke the sound, the feeling of the Baroque tradition, and the great German tradition. And Wagner writes about the impression this Brahms piece gave on him. He says, it's amazing, it's extraordinary, better word, what one can still do with these old forms when one knows what one is doing. And exactly at the same time, Wagner begins the composition of Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg. Now, I can't show cause and effect, but it would be really amazing to think that this masterpiece was inspired by Brahms, who, of course, Brahms and Wagner are always thought of as these great historical enemies, which is very much an understatement. I mean, not an understatement. It's not true. I mean, it's more complicated than that. So, in a way, Meistersinger grows out of this desire to reinvent himself and to break from his own past and find a new future. And he does this by inventing a past and inventing a musical past. And he does so on several different layers. So I'm going to first explore a little bit the different kind of layers that Wagner does to create a sense of past in Meistersinger. One other thing before I go into this, into the more detailed music thing, watch my clock, is talking about Meistersinger as a work which is really based on the role of the artist in society. Somebody wrote, it really struck me how true this is, that this is a piece that each act ends with the response of a public to a performance of a new song. Think about it. The first act begins with Walter's performance of Fang it an. It's not actually in public exactly, but there's all the Meistersingers plus the Lehrbuben, the apprentices. And the response to it is what? A riot, basically. They're screaming and yelling and jumping up and down and it's kind of a contained riot. Okay, the second act has a public song. It's Beckmesser's Serenade. And it literally has a riot. A total riot. People are at each other's throats on the streets. The third act also ends with a public song, the prize song. And it ends not with a riot, but with peace, unification, and general sense of rejuvenation and purpose in life. In other words, it brings people together. The other two cause great division. In a certain kind of way, this also introduces not just the old and new, but bad versus good art. Now, it's not that Fang it an is by any means bad art, and I'm not even at all convinced, I'll show, that Beckmesser's song is bad art either. But they're bad in a certain kind of way, and their response was disorder, riot, hatred, warfare. Whereas the prize song, which I'm not sure in every respect is the epitome of good art either exactly in Meistersinger, nevertheless brings about harmony. So how does this happen? So first thing, let's talk about the sources. The Wagner creates a historical path. This is his one historical work, one based really, Tannhäuser kind of, but based really in history, and supposedly in 1564 on June 23rd and June 24th, so we even know exactly when. And we hear a very, very important seminal thing right at the beginning after the curtain rises. That's the basis. It elaborates a little bit into a second verse. Now, this sounds so much like a Lutheran-type Protestant hymn that I think that most people would think this actually is one. It's not. It's composed by Wagner. But it really, very successfully, I think, evokes the era. Now, it's a very important thing to note. Wagner makes no attempt whatsoever to be historically accurate. This music, even though it's sort of, I said Lutheran, this is not by any means a 16th century hymn, which would have a completely different kind of harmonic, would not have the harmonic language. No, this is a hymn in the style of Bach. And even though this piece takes place in 1564, the musical past of this piece would be 1720. 1710, 1720. And that's for a variety of reasons. One reason, of course, it's closer to Wagner. He knows this world. He understands this world. He can also incorporate it into his own world. In other words, the music that he's writing in 1864, 1865 can fit into the Bach world, whereas it would not be able to fit into the world of the 16th century music. And also, and this is perhaps even more important, he wants to play into his listener. This world to his listeners conjures up the past, conjures up a certain kind of past. And this is, by the way, obviously it's a wonderful chorale. And it's the generator, although I'm not going to talk too much about that aspect today, a tremendous amount of the music in Meistersinger. A lot of the music in Meistersinger grows out of this chorale. Okay, so let's talk, then there's a second source piece, the text of which is actually by the historical Hans Sachs, but certainly not the music. The Wach-auf chorale, which we first hear actually in the orchestra in the prelude of Act 3, but then we hear the whole everybody sing it. Wagner never quite wants to cadence these things. And, of course, then the explosion of people. Now, this one also, this even less sounds like something from Luther, but nevertheless, it conjures up this world. There is a third. I actually prepared this entire talk today, and it occurred to me that there is a third song in this piece, which also is supposed to conjure up an actual historical song, and that's... And again, that actually almost could be 16th century, not quite, not the harmonization. But nevertheless, so these represent, and one thing I wanted to point, all these are very benign. We hear these as listeners as this, the past in this sense as good. No question, the past as something nurturing and good and definitely. Now, there is another way that Wagner, all through Meistersinger, conjures up the past. And this is a way that I think at first must have been very difficult for him, and then he started having a lot of fun with it. But it also explains one interesting aspect of Meistersinger. It took him a long time. He worked on Meistersinger continuously for 4 years, and that was a long time. He wrote Tristan in like 20 months, and Tristan was in an entirely new idiom in all ways. And yet Meistersinger, which was an old-fashioned, in some ways, idiom, took him so much longer. And that's because Meistersinger is so explicitly contrapuntal. It evokes the polyphonic, which means multi-voiced music that was the style of Bach, the style in this music world that he is evoking, which is the early 1700s. And so the whole piece is constantly, I mean, the most famous examples of it would be, sort of the most ostentatious would be at the end of the prelude. I'm not going to try to play it. When he has 5 things going on at once, you know, he's really kind of showing off. Also, he's probably a little wink to Mozart, because Mozart does that very famously at the end of the last movement of the Jupiter Symphony. So there's sort of an inside comment there, a joke, or whatever you want to call it. So the polyphonic texture of all of Meistersinger is a constant reminder of it. But then there are other themes in Meistersinger, which are not themes of the past, but nevertheless themes which conjure up sort of the idea of the past. They're not supposed to be. See, we hear these themes. We hear the Night Watchman song, and that's supposed to be something they sang in 1564. And we hear the St. John's Chorale that opens the piece. That's supposed to be, they're supposed to be singing it historically. Now, this is not. This is the famous... Certainly, this with its very rock-solid, square, symmetrical form, conjures up the sort of the solidity of the past and the solidity of the Meistersingers. Now, unlike the chorale or the 2 chorales, the Wagner chorale, also, this one is more complex in our association. Certainly, it has a warm and firm and I guess basically positive, but also slightly ridiculous. And that's even more the case with the other theme of this sort, which comes in just a little bit later in the overture, the Meistersinger March. same time, it's a little bit self-pompous and just, and Wagner knows this. And of course, he makes he makes fun of it, and he'll use that making fun of it chatter from the overture again when Beckmesser comes out to sing his song. In other words, and he makes fun of the theme as well. Not makes fun of it exactly, but he pokes fun at it. Let's call it that way, a little lighter term, because he recognizes the pomposity, in other words, already it has a different relationship to the past. The relationship of the past to the chorale is one of nobility, strictly. The one of the past of these themes, which I think are associated with the Meistersinger, with the guild and everything, is full of respect and has a sense of their solidity, but at the same time is very aware of their flaws, and they're slightly ridiculous. And they certainly are. And they were treated, these themes can be treated. And mostly so, and someone like the person of Kotner, when he does his great presentation, where we hear the themes, we hear that theme in a particular version that's associated with the tablatur, the table that has the rules. And he does all those ridiculous coloratura, bravura things in his thing. I mean, it's funny, and it's making fun of, but with fondness, let's say, making fun of the Meistersingers and their pomp and circumstance and their traditions and their hidebound sense and all this. This brings me to a very important point, which actually is what I mentioned before about Tannhäuser and the big difference. One of the things that Wagner does in Meistersinger is he compares, I won't call it bad art, but less good art, imperfect art, which certainly would be the case of Kotner's. I mean, it's kind of silly and ridiculous, with great art, which we'll see too. And because he wants to define, as you have to, you can only define black in terms of white or vice versa. You have to have this contrast. Well, he does the same thing in Tannhäuser too. He wants to show how the traditional songs that at the competition at the Wartburg that the other knights sing to Elizabeth are bad. They're not good music, and then whereas supposedly at least a Tannhäuser song is good. But the problem is that Wagner wrote bad music for them, or not so much bad music as boring music, as stilted, and he recognized that it doesn't work. You can't just do bad music just to make a point. People have to sit through it. And of course he started cutting. He cut and cut and cut and cut that scene for that reason. But he couldn't get rid of it because it's absolutely essential to the action. So how does he get away with it in Meistersinger? Not just get away with it, but runs with it, makes a huge success of it by turning it into comedy. One of the ways in which Meistersinger has to be a comedy, besides the fact that it has a happy ending and no one dies, is that the elements of ridicule, the elements of criticism, the elements of, let's say, even bad, are always done with the eye on comedy. And this light of comedy, which I think really transforms and transcends this element, let's say, of mockery. So let's look at some other of these songs that represent sort of the old-fashioned way. Now here's one that you might not even think about, but absolutely, and it's a fantastic song. One of the problems of Meistersinger is it's such an incredibly big score that it's always hard to find anything. That's why I have all these stickums in my score. But there's something. Yes, here we go. So it's hard to start this one. The main tune is. Sorry, can't see the lights in my eye. I should have rehearsed that. In other words, Hans's song, the Your Room song. It's a very simple, lively, comic song. Very definitely old-fashioned, strophic. I mean, very, very much an old-fashioned kind of song. It's a good song. We enjoy it. He sings it 3 times, and as a good strophic song should be. Strophic just means it has verses, and but of course the circumstance is comic, and it's a good song for another reason. What is the song for? It's a song. It's a cobbling song. He's your room. He's whapping on his shoe that he's making. He's making the sole of a shoe. I don't know how they do that, but that's, I'm not sure Wagner did either. He knew they used pitch and wax or whatever, all the rhymes he does with Zachs. But in any case, he's making the shoe, and it's a very appropriate song. That's a very important point. In other words, it's lively, it's sort of it repeats itself over and over again, but it's a nice, lively song. So let's look at another song, which is very definitely an old-fashioned song, that we hear right afterwards. Actually, I don't even need to turn the page because this one is really simple. And it goes on a little bit. But just taking it as its rudimentary things. Of course, this is Beckmesser's song, Beckmesser's Serenade. Now, if you just look at it from a strictly musical standpoint and just the basic song itself, it's every bit as good a song. The heavens are going to come down and strike me now, I'm afraid. It's every bit as good a song as Hans's Your Room, right? But it's a bad song. So why is it a bad song? Well, one reason, of course, it's a bad song, and Hans Sachs will take it apart, is because it absolutely makes no attempt whatsoever to have the words and the music go together. So he's putting all the accents on the wrong syllables. I mean, this is an element which is very, very funny, which I always think probably gets mixed to a non-German audience. I think like that, because it would be if every time there is a verb like listened, it would always come out as listened, because that's just the way that's precisely how he does it. So it's a horrible. He hasn't bothered. He has his tune, and he sticks the words onto the tune willy-nilly. And Hans even makes some very good suggestions how he might have fixed that. But there's another reason why Beckmesser's tune is bad. And I think this is remarkably overlooked, I think, a lot of the time. And that's that it's so completely inappropriate. It's also a jolly tune, very much in the... They're both sort of jolly sort of work tunes. You know, they both have very similar sorts of character. But this is a love song. He's supposedly singing this tune to show his great love for Eva so that she'll marry him, right? And the words are also pretty ludicrous, because he basically says, I want to marry you because you're rich. But he tries to dresses it up in nicer terms. But nevertheless, it's a love song. And it's a terrible love song. It's a good song, but it's a terrible love song. And the word setting is terrible. Then there's another thing. Wagner doesn't particularly like the coloratura. Wagner never much liked coloratura, and he makes fun of it already when in Italian opera. Now, this is ridiculous coloratura. What makes it even more ridiculous is where it comes from. I don't have time. This is the kind of subject I really like talking about. Meistersinger is an amazing tour de force of transformation. And I will talk a little bit about some of that. But all the gargling sort of stuff that Beckmesser does comes from it's the same descending fourths. So that's could arguably be the basic love motive of Meistersinger. So in other words, all that's left of love in his song, which is so inappropriate, is this silly gargling coloratura. So it's kind of a very raw and subtle commentary on Beckmesser's song. But I think it's very important to recognize, and I think one of the blessings of for instance, the performance we have at the Met now of Meistersinger is that Beckmesser is a good singer. Beckmesser is a master singer. He's the Stadtschreiber. He's the town clerk. I mean, he's an educated man. It's a horribly wrong song, silly song, but it's mostly just a completely inappropriate song. And people roar with laughter because the word. And then, of course, when he sings it in the last act, he's not only has his own words to it, which were at least fit, although they just didn't fit with the syllables, but that he tries to put the words which he hasn't learned by heart of the prize song, of Walter's poem, to it. And that now, of course, it makes no sense at all, because he's, instead of saying, dangling from a tree, he says, I hang myself on the tree. Or it's full of the aromas of spring, he says it's bloody like spring. And actually the Met translation that you get does a fairly good job. It's based on small, little tiny, like the difference between blutig and blütig in German, full of bloom and full of blood. And he gets them all wrong. So the people are roaring with laughter at his song, not because it's such a stupid song, because the music's so bad, but because the words are so ridiculous. So it's the complete inappropriateness. And this is a very deep criticism. What did Wagner criticize in so much of Italian opera? This goes back when he was writing during his essay period, opera and drama and all music of the future and everything, is precisely that the music was not appropriate to the emotions, not appropriate to the situation. The composers had sort of stock tunes, and that you could kind of plug them in at will, and they didn't necessarily fit the emotion. Of course, Wagner recognized this is not always the case, but it is a basic criticism. And so in that respect, Beckmesser, in a funny kind of way, falls into that same basic problem. So, of course, Beckmesser also in this respect becomes a highly comic figure. His song is by no means boring, like the songs like Bittwolf or something song in Act 2 of Tannhäuser. It's highly amusing. But it's bad because of its inappropriateness. It has a bad effect on society. Okay, so now let's look at some new songs and see what their effect is on society. And for new songs, I think the first obviously we look to is Walter. I think a traditional view of Meistersinger would be that Walter is the artist of the future, that Hans is the artist of the present, that the Meistersingers are the artists of the past, and that Walter is the artist of the future. I don't really quite sign on to that view. I'm a little bit dubious about Walter's future as an artist, actually. But nevertheless, he does present these very new ideas. And he does it in two songs that he sings when he first comes on to present himself at the songs I can't say it in English, the song school. There it is, at the end of Act 1. And the first song, of course, is completely by accident. It's not really a song. It's his presentation, who he studied with, who he is. One of the interesting things, and I think a very important comment that Wagner makes about the song, is that in his first song, I'm Still in Herd, etc. That he sings a perfect two strophes, as one of the Meistersingers, I think Vogelsang, points out, that he may not have studied with good teachers, but he sings perfect Stollen, perfect strophes of a song by nature. So Wagner does seem to be saying that the musical forms that work grow out of nature. So, I mean, it's a nice tune, and it introduces some nice ideas. I don't know how memorable it would be on its own. This becomes, I think, much more the case when we look at his big tune, the Fagnedan, his big aria. Or it's not an aria, but his big song. It's very hard to play because of the very nature of it. It's so kind of amorphous. It starts. Introduces a little bit later. Which is one of the two big ideas are the thirds, and then, but it's, as you remember from hearing it, it's all caught up in this extraordinary whirlwind of sound. He's completely carried away by his passions. And of course, The strophes are very asymmetrical and get longer. The second one is much longer than the first. And of course, as he hears Beckmesser doing the mark, he adds his business about the owl in the bushes and all these things about the stranger, which are not necessarily very pleasant associations with the evil one, the enemy. And anyway, it's a wild song. It's a wild, passionate song. And of course, the Meister. Well, Beckmesser, of course, was determined to sing it. But actually, probably, even if Beckmesser weren't determined to sing it, is it a song that would have passed muster to the Meistersingers? No. No. It's too disorderly, too wild, it has, as we'll see, glorious things in it. But these things somehow are so confused and so mixed up in this whirlwind of sound that it doesn't make sense. It's great, but not successful. And we really see this, and this is one of the big points of Meistersinger. Only later, when Hans remembers the song. First, when does he remember the song? He remembers the song when he's by himself, and he sings the famous Flieder monologue, about how the linden tree smells so sweet. And it starts... orchestra all reminds him of this. In other words, he's thinking about the song. Well, already just on this is incomparably more beautiful than what we heard from this. It's a quotation, although the horns elaborate much further, make something much more poetic out of it. And this taken by itself, the second, which is the main part of this. And then, of course, Wagner does his magic with harmonies. If I start... of course, this is gloriously beautiful now. Now, there is something here besides the fact that Hans has crystallized the ideas of the song. He's found the kernel of the song because Hans is the artist. He understands the beauty of the song and he turns it into something beautiful and great in the Flieder monologue. He does something else, though, and this is a subject that lies very dear to my heart. Wagner shows that the music takes on meaning to us as we remember it. This is, of course, one of the main techniques in the Ring, but in all of Wagner. In other words, as we remember, and as Hans remembers, and we remember through him, the song, and Hans makes order of the song takes on this extraordinary beauty. Now I'm going to get to the last new song in just 1 second, which is the prize song itself. Now, the prize song is kind of composed together with Walter and Hans Sachs, and it's the composition scene is sometimes called the third scene of Act 3. I think is the heart of Meistersinger, the greatest scene probably in Meistersinger, and really in some ways one of the greatest scenes in all of opera and all of human art, really, in a way, because it really goes into the very heart of the matter. Is what is art? Where does art come from? And how do you find inspiration in art? Because, obviously, it all starts when Wagner wakes up, and he says he's had a wonderful dream. Now, I love the fact, this is one of Wagner's very subtle. When he says he's had this wonderful dream, I have to find this, sorry. We hear this series of really, really beautiful harmonies. Well, we hear first, when he first says he has a dream, we just hear the beginning of the harmonies, just. Later on, we'll hear the whole series of harmonies. I'll play the whole series of harmonies later in a different excerpt I'm going to play. But these magical harmonies, I mean, these very out of the ordinary, are actually kind of a quote from Mendelssohn's Midsummer Night's Dream. They open the overture of Midsummer Night's Dream, and of course they introduced the idea of magic. That some kind of magic enchantment is being taken place, and of course enchantment does take place as he comes with his telling of his dream, the vision of his dream becoming a song. Now, one thing which I think is extraordinary about this scene is dominated by this theme, which occurs just in a million ways in the scene, moving in and out of all the lines and with extraordinary beauty. And what's interesting now, it comes from someplace else in Meistersinger, but this is the same as from The Ring, which is the basic love motive of The Ring. That runs all the way through The Ring. It's also the subject of my dissertation that I was writing at the same time as Vicki Bond when we were together at Juilliard. So there you go. Now, so this would seem to say something very subliminally, perhaps, but what the nature about what is art? Where does art come from? Well, art comes from love. Would be what ultimately Hans Sachs is saying. Love, not like Jack and Jill, but love in the big sense. So in the course of this thing, he writes the prize song. And the prize song is in itself, okay, I can play it by memory, but I might as well find it. He scandalizes Hans, not really scandalizes, when he repeats it, he goes to the other key. Which really, so far, is practically one concrete difference between it and the other traditional songs. The prize song is remarkably traditional. Think how much more traditional it is than the crazy Fang An song with all of its running around in crazy harmonies and things like this. But I often think, and I'm very moved to think about, what an incredible chance Wagner took. I mean, he's based this whole piece on this creation of a new song which will somehow transcend the other ones. And what if it had been a flop? What if it hadn't been good enough? But it is. And there's a very funny, I don't know if any of you in this room know the Brahms Second Violin Sonata. It starts exactly the same as the prize song. Well, it's not an accident. And there's actually, going back to the Brahms-Wagner story, Brahms came about having, through a complicated chain of events, the only orchestral score of the Paris version of Tannhäuser. And Wagner desperately needed it. So he writes Brahms and says, could I have it back? And Brahms says, yes, only if you'll give me something in return. And so what Wagner gives in return is a beautiful bound manuscript of Meistersinger. And I think that his quoting the prize song in his violin sonata is sort of a homage. So the relationship between Wagner and Brahms is not so, they're not such terrible enemies as they're depicted. I think their supporters were terrible enemies, which is kind of more really to the point. So the prize song is, it's grows out of this communication between Hans and Walter, and it's the crowning song. But in a way, it's quite a traditional song. Now, of course, it becomes as soon as Walter gets his hands on it and on his own. When he sings it in public, of course, he changes it because starts. That whole extra little dream sequence, and that dream sequence in the second verse becomes even much longer. In some productions, they have Hans Sachs jump up in dismay or in surprise, in any case, because this is not the song that, of course, he sang for him. He's already developed. Now, it's kind of immaterial whether this makes the song better or not, but it does say something about the nature, and I think something that Wagner is trying to say about the nature. It may be this wonderful song, this perfect vision, but it immediately is developed. It immediately is changed. So in art, there is no perfection. There is no standing point. There is no saying, this is it, and this is where we stop. It moves on. If Walter were to sing the prize song again at the next occasion, I'm sure it would be very different. May not even be as good, but it would certainly still be different. But this is not the only song that we hear changed. We've already noticed how in the Flieder monologue, Hans Sachs transforms Fangen an, Walter's first aria, into something much more glorious. But what about the simple from Your Room, the song that he sings when he's making the shoe? So it comes back too, completely glorified. In the prelude of Act 3, start this one. We hear actually both parts of the. I'm going to start. See, that's from the. This is something else. So, I mean, this is one of the most beautiful passages, I think, in the entire opera. He's transformed this silly song now into this it's incredibly, sounds like all of Bruckner's symphonies, everything, the best thing about Bruckner's symphonies condensed into like 8 measures. It just sounds a lot like, it's Bruckner's, this is before Bruckner, but it does sound a lot like Bruckner. Now, just going on one more little thing. I'm supposed to be done. So there are some elements that are completely new in the piece. In other words, they outside the whole framework of the story of the opera that don't fit within the view of this Baroque world. One would be, which we actually first hear by itself in the prelude of Act 3, but we hear it in the third verse of his Your Room of the Schuster song, of the making the shoe song. Sort of stands for his sadness. Another one, probably my favorite theme in Meistersinger. It's hard to say that, but it would be. etc., which it occurs over and over in the after the night watch, but it has to do with the magic of the night. And these are more like outside. They're like Greek chorus songs. They're commenting on the action. And to finish my talk today, I want to mention one other example of sort of the Greek chorus moment in the sense that it's outside the rest of the action. There are other places, like for instance when Ava quotes Tristan, her whole, and Sag's mein Freund. That's, again, sort of something which is outside the piece, looking in from the outside. But this one, the beginning of this is just a development of what we started the talk with today, with the original, now in C major, good solid C major, Meistersinger key, the chorale, and it transforms into the ultimate opposite, the real music of the future in a certain kind of way for Wagner, which of course is the music of the quintet, during which he also quotes again from Tristan and also the Ring. So this Wagner said while writing Tristan, and I actually spoke on this here, that his greatest talent was, genius perhaps, was that of transition. Well, this is one of the greatest of all transitions. So first thing, it's going to have the magic chords lifted from Mendelssohn to show the magic of the dream. Of course, Tristan. Let's see. In other words, the transformation from the chorale to the quintet. And it's this kind of almost magical alchemy of taking the past and transforming it into a really glorious present and future. Thank you.